This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you.
Okay, so I'm the fourth accountant, and today I wanted to check out this video by Chris Norland, if I've remembered his name correctly. And this is a finance analyst who I followed and subscribed to. Really great channel. And he covers a number of things, but one of the things that he's been covering that's caught my attention is the SpaceX IPO and share price since then, and how it has been, as many people have expected, declining. So at the time of recording, the share price is about 11% down on what it was at closing at the IPO, at the date of IPO. And there continues obviously to be speculation regarding the long-term price that SpaceX will achieve. So obviously, according to the prospectus, it's obviously going to go literally to the moon, no pun intended, or Mars, depending on what we think SpaceX is going to achieve. But obviously many cynics are looking at SpaceX, looking at the AI industry and sector in general, which seems to be propping up much of the valuation of SpaceX, and speculating actually that this is part of a wider bubble. Potentially this bubble could be shorted, not financial advice, but that is some speculation that is doing the rounds, albeit we wouldn't know the timing of this bubble bursting, and potentially essentially basically leaving us in a situation whereby those early investors, such as Elon Musk, being the founder of SpaceX, and those that would have backed him initially with respect to the acquisition of Twitter, basically cashing out as part of the IPO and once their lockup periods end, and then the rest of the retail investors and those acquiring or exposed to assets via index funds, for example, being left basically holding the bag, as they say. So the economics of the situation feels very much like a pump and dump, similar to what we might see in the crypto space. So as I say, I found this analyst quite entertaining. I do enjoy his content and his videos, and I highly recommend checking out the source material for yourself, which is why I will leave a link. But yes, let's dive into this video and see what we can learn.
Can someone explain to me, like I'm 5 years old, why SpaceX is crashing right now? And this is referring to the stock. It's down, what, 13% today.
Yeah, so crashing is obviously a subjective term. 13% drop is not great. As I say, at the time I was looking at this, it is about 11%, so there's been a 2% recovery. The point is that prices, share prices in the short term, and certainly crypto, if you think about that, is and can be quite volatile. And that is why, ideally, in my view, SpaceX should have been subject to a seasoning period, as would normally be the case, before it's then included in index funds.
Turns out Elon's losing one of his key people. Ex-product chief Nikita Beer is leaving after 1 year.
Elon Musk typically, with his businesses, it's not unusual that many of the significant or leadership positions people have left. So I know that was the case with Tesla when he bought Tesla. I'm not sure what happened with PayPal when he got involved in that. But again, I think there was a clash between himself and the other founders. So I can't remember if it was XPay and PayPal combined. I think that's how Peter Thiel initially made some money as well, who is the founder or one of the co-founders of Palantir. But again, I know he rubs people the wrong way. Egos can clash. So for me, it's not that surprising that in companies where Elon Musk has an involvement, either as founder or somebody that has acquired the business, that some of the senior leadership find that they feel the need to leave that said business.
And this has been a steady stream, or you could say the biggest exit door in history, where people are leaving. You can see right here, and this guy's really important for them. I remember he was just talking about how he was leading, the X money thing. They're going to be the bank or whatever, and talking about making, X the greatest platform on earth or whatever. And if this is such a great time for the company, like why are all these people stepping down, leaving, and otherwise? You can see.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that he's pointing this out because I think it's understood by anyone that follows Elon Musk, is that I think he wants to mirror the WePay app, I think, in China, where it's kind of this everything app. And when you look at the prospectus for SpaceX, although it's called SpaceX, it kind of feels like this everything company. And therefore, its market is just, its potential market is absolutely huge, and therefore that is what's been substantiating the valuation. So again, if this individual is key to this everything proposition, it is interesting, and it is something of a little bit of a red flag, without being hyperbolic, that this individual is leaving.
And again, other people are jumping ship. Here's another one. This is Parsa. Parsa says, yesterday was my last day at SpaceX AI. And again, insiders are going to be allowed to sell tomorrow, so I wouldn't be shocked if people are like, you know what, I'm getting out and I'm cashing out. Time to go home. And then this is Nikita. And again, this is one of the key people over at X. And you have to remember too, Elon lost a whole bunch of people at Tesla and otherwise. It's like,
Yeah, exactly. As I was saying, he did lose a whole bunch of people at Tesla. And obviously, infamously, when he joined, when he acquired Twitter, I should say, he definitely completely challenged the existing culture. And a lot of people that were probably rich enough based on their shareholdings, and their employment stocks, probably would have left. So again, it's interesting that some of these individuals at SpaceX AI, are deciding that it's time for them to move on, just as the company is being listed, right? So again, it doesn't send the signals that this is a long-term play for many of the people that have been involved in SpaceX at a very early stage.
that's why they don't have any new stuff out, because you need people to do it. Elon can't do it by himself. Elon's a moron, as you know. So here's Nikita. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to pass the torch and demote myself to my natural state, a poster. I'll be stepping back from leading product for X and will continue on as an advisor. So again, that's coming from Elon's key dudes. Also, I guess Elon's cars are crashing. Let's take a look at this. Fred says this is a great example of a Tesla FSD crash. Tesla could again say that the driver took over before impact, and it would be true. But again, you have to ask yourself, would the crash have happened without FSD? Clearly not.
Yeah, and this is an ongoing theme as well, I think, with Elon Musk, whereby he promises so much. So obviously, he promised us robots, he promised us self-driving cars, and we are yet to see these things. And now these businesses and these IPs, I suspect, and this is intellectual property, is probably being wrapped up in this SpaceX proposition, which is now being listed. And now we're being promised trips to the moons and basically supersonic jets, that will, or rockets that will take us across the world, in record speed. So again, these things may happen. And obviously, from a share price perspective, if they have the technology, that could one day be leveraged to achieve these things, even if they don't achieve these things themselves, that could still justify somewhat a valuation, that is akin or similar to what was theoretically outlined in their prospectus. But ultimately, from many people's perspective, including mine, the proof is in the pudding, right? So if they actually have, the IP, to do this, then why hasn't it happened would be the question, right? So we would have to look at trademarks, we'd have to look at copyrights, we'd have to look at intellectual property to see if theoretically they own the technology to do these things, or they own the method they have invented to do these things. And then obviously the hope would be, for many people that have shares in SpaceX, for example, is that they'll one day get it to work in a way that is safe and reliable, and can get regulators and legislators on side.
I would never recommend SpaceX if Musk weren't involved. I know this company will need far more money than it currently has, but unlike so many others, I'm confident that Musk can raise all the money he needs and see this through.
And that's interesting that this individual, and he's actually quite famous, I can't remember his name, but he's someone that, he's a stock picker, essentially, I think, and he does, he's quite famous, and a lot of people follow his picks. But it's interesting that he says, look, essentially what I'm interpreting from what he's saying is like, I'm not interested in the economics or the financials because Elon Musk is involved. And I think for me, that kind of sums up the sentiment of many of Elon Musk's endeavors, where because he is involved, that seems to garner the attention, garner a premium, and drive capital towards the businesses he's involved in, actually. And obviously, he does or did have a good relationship with Donald Trump. So again, it seems like he has political clout as well as regulatory clout by accelerating his inclusion of the SpaceX stock in some index funds. So not all of them, but some of them, right? And listed in the exchange as well. So in some respects, what this individual is saying does have some merit, because a normal business that looks like this would be viewed quite cynically, even if the CEO is quite talented, right? But the fact that Elon Musk has the connections and the clout and the influence he does make the assessment of what this could be different.
Maybe you don't believe me. Do you think your children, or if you're older, your grandchildren, won't be doing stuff on the moon someday? Do you think that orbital data centers won't make sense? Even they can get all the power from the sun and all the cooling from space. Nobody lives.
I don't buy into any of that, right? But what I would say that I do agree with is that when we buy shares or assets, it is good to consider what your timeline looks like, and actually that timeline may extend beyond your own lifetime, right? So SpaceX may not appreciate; it may depreciate actually in your own lifetime. But if you actually believe in this company generationally, it may make sense to buy these assets now and buy shares in SpaceX now. Again, not financial advice. I'm just providing context here to support what this individual is saying, knowing that it may be of benefit to your beneficiaries, i.e. your children, your wife, your husband, whoever, in their lifetime, right? So the important point I think is alluding to here is that this could, or any other investment could, make sense if your timeline is much longer, right? And arguably even longer than your own lifetime.
It's up there. Might end up being the only place that the politicians let us put them. So do this. Think about it. Maybe you put some away for the next generation, or even the one after that. Hey, back in the day, people bought 100-year railroad bonds that paid off.
Don't buy, don't buy.
Here's the bottom line. SpaceX could be a 100-year piece of paper, too.
So I guess SpaceX, according to Kramer, think about your grandkids, playing on the moon, space data centers.
It just makes me think of the Jetsons, to be honest. And again, objectively, do we believe that's going to happen? And even if it did happen, what do the economics look like, right? Who is the customer, right? Who are the people that can afford to go to Mars or the moon and pay for it, right? So I think these are all things we have to consider. And despite the aspirational idea of, okay, let me leave something meaningful for my children, let's say, if you have any, or whoever your beneficiaries or legacies are, it has to be grounded in economic and financial reality, I think, is where Chris Norland is alluding to here. And I do agree with him, right? So I think we can learn a lot from what we're hearing generally here. But I think for me, what we cannot do is look at something like a SpaceX and treat it as a hit and hope.
Just start off, give me your reaction to, the idea of $1 trillion in revenues from this company would be 10 times at least where they are right now in an ARR. And I guess, even chance that they could get there sooner.
Well, if anybody can do it, Elon can. I think.
Yeah, but Elon is not an alchemist, right? So where does $1 trillion of revenue come from? And what is the timeline? And I think Elon Musk has communicated a timeline. But the reason I say this is because obviously $1 trillion now is different from $1 trillion in 10 years or 20 years time, when you take into account the time value of money, which is basically an indirect measure of inflation, right? So I think for me, again, my question would be, is there actually $1 trillion of free cash flow available to SpaceX, right? Do we have it, right? Or does the government need to print more? So it's interesting that he says if anyone can do it, Elon Musk can do it. I guess in a sense that is true. But as I say, Elon Musk is not an alchemist, and he can't magic more resources, and he can't magic more currency or cash, and put that in his customers' hands in order for them to pay him, right? So yeah, to me, some of this doesn't really make too much sense, and it does feel slightly delusional in some ways, if I'm being honest.
This has the potential to really be the first $10 trillion company out there and growing. He's building civilizational level infrastructure. The challenge is, I don't think the market knows how to value this company. It's not a company. It's really 4 different businesses that are wrapped into a vertical.
He does potentially have a point that we don't know how to value this company, but that doesn't mean the company is undervalued, right? Which seems to be the implication of what he's saying. If we don't know how to value it, there's also a risk we've overvalued it, right? And then this argument that he's saying it's not really a company, it's a 4-company vertical, that's still a company, right? So again, if it operates in an economic and commercial way, it has shareholders, i.e. Elon Musk, and that shareholder is becoming wealthier as a result of commercial activities, it is a business, right? So I'm not sure what he's getting at, and trying to argue or present it as some sort of special thing. And ultimately, just because we don't know how to value it, arguably, doesn't mean the valuation is too low, is essentially what I'm arguing. It could equally be too high, right? That is the risk when you don't know how to value something.
$10 trillion, guys. $10 trillion company. This is like the most amazing company in the world. We're building civilization. So that's the pros, right? And the bros can always come and tell me how dumb I am and I don't know anything about.
And at that valuation, right, it's worth more than Apple and Nvidia, right, for example. And I think you have to ask yourself, does that feel sensible? Does that feel right? It's sort of like, as Greg Gisette would say, who's a famous influencer on YouTube, a fitness influencer, does it meet the eye test, the sniff test? So even if you just ignore the financials, does that actually feel sensible? Would be my question.
Elon Musk said that he's pulled forward his expectations. SpaceX hits $1 trillion of revenue to 2030.
Yeah, so as I was saying, $1 trillion in 4 years' time, even though that's not that long away at the time of recording, is still different from $1 trillion now, right? So what is that $1 trillion in today's value? So it's a very nice, attention-grabbing number. But ultimately, what is the pathway to that? I don't know. And where is this $1 trillion of free cash flow in the global economy would be my other question, right? Without the banks printing more money, like where does this cash physically actually come from?
2031, and that there is a non-zero chance that that happens 2029. Are you able to model for that?
I would frame it like this. So we have a forecast out there, right? That's you can see on Bloomberg is much lower than that. And I think the way to frame it in the context of stock is to get a much higher stock value, you do not need to hit 1 trillion by 2030.
So you notice he didn't actually answer the question about can you model for that, right? So maybe he will, but that's conspicuous by its absence, that answer, or lack of answer, right? Because that's fundamentally my question, right? Because if we have $1 trillion globally to pay for SpaceX and whatever it's doing, do we still have money left over to buy food? And that's a question many financial analysts, for example, have asked in a roundabout way when they've done their own assessment of the potential valuation and available market to SpaceX, right? And in a very simple way, that's the point I'm making here. There's only so much cash in the world without printing more. And if you take up a lot of that cash for things like paying for AI, instead of, say, electricity, instead of, say, water, instead of, say, food, how does that even work, right?
I do want to point this out, guys, because the Americans, they come out and with SpaceX, whatever, and tell you how awesome, how rich y'all going to be. I live here in Korea, and true story, we've been seeing these Samsung phones. They were just announced. This is the headline in Bloomberg. Samsung pre-orders for latest foldables jumped 30% from the last year. And I always tell you the truth on stuff. Like, I have an iPhone. I like Apple phones. I do. But these new Samsung phones, I mean, we've been seeing them. They're everywhere here. They're pretty good, just to be frank. Like, they got this new one. It's more like a wallet / passport size. Now, Apple's going to come out with that similar kind of thing this fall. I think that's the rumor. It's going to be like a wallet passport size. I actually really like that form factor. I didn't think I would, but it's pretty cool. And so, we'll see. And I'm bringing up the Samsung thing because, with SpaceX, the way the bros talk about it, it's like the only company in the world, the same way that some people say, oh, well, Apple's the only company in the world. I mean, Samsung's.
Yeah, no, this is something I think Patrick Boyle, who's another massive financial analyst on YouTube, mentioned actually these valuations, and I think it's true of many valuations actually, is that they treat the company that's going to list as the company that's going to win and monopolize the entire industry, right? So, there's Anthropic, there's OpenAI, there's Google, obviously Meta have a stake in this as well, and indirectly Nvidia and Oracle, I suspect as well, with respect to data centers and GPUs. And everyone thinks they're going to win, and every one of their investors thinks they are going to be the winning company, right? And I think it is right to flag that actually it's not a given that that's going to be the case. And actually, in a healthy free market economy where hopefully there continues to be competition for the benefit of the consumer, there shouldn't be just one winner, actually. And regulation, and more specifically, competition. So these will be regulators, I can't remember the names of them, that will ensure there is sufficient competition and no natural monopolies, should ensure the fact that there isn't just one winner, right? And then we get basically shitification of services as a result of this. So I think for me, again, that's something else that has to be considered when thinking about all of these things, right? Is it realistic to think that there's going to be one player when all is said and done, and then they are free to capture 100% of any market share and or available free cash flow, i.e. this $1 trillion of revenue?
Legitimate company, the same way BYD is a legitimate car company, or otherwise. Like, you're going to get more competition in the space, and there's a lot of stuff that you may not necessarily see in the USA because they're blocking it out. And if SpaceX ever becomes successful, I'm saying that there are other companies out there that are going to figure out, okay, if that's profitable, I'm going to jump in that.
Yeah, so often what you'll find with this kind of thing is that they'll create moats, for example. And what this basically means is massive barriers to entry. And they may leverage regulation, they may leverage their relationship with politicians. But also they could do things like Apple are famously doing, by creating these walled gardens where inside the garden it's really great. The experience is lovely, but it's very difficult to basically integrate Apple with any other type of technology. And obviously the regulators and legislators have had to step in to address this. When you think about, for example, their peripherals and the USB-C ports and things like that. So there are ways, if you have a first mover advantage, to create these moats, to create these barriers of entry. But the reality is, the competition companies like SpaceX face are from other massive, titanic companies such as Apple, who are not doing it, but I'm just using them as an example. Google, Meta, and obviously places, companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are heavily backed. So again, if they can see that whatever SpaceX is doing is working, they're obviously going to try and compete if they can.
Space too, right?
Yesterday in terms of near-term goals and 2030 goals of $1 trillion in revenue. I mean, look, it sounds ambitious, and the reason why the market is not believing, Elon Musk right now with SpaceX forecast is because of what's happened with robo-taxis and some of his other forecasts. I mean,
Exactly. So if you don't have a track record of delivery, you kind of lose a bit of credibility, even if you are Elon Musk, right? And again, he's somebody who doesn't present himself as being trustworthy or truthful. And when I say this, even things like when you think about the Joe Rogan interview he did, where he talked about this game where he was trying to present himself as this like expert at this really, you know, difficult, I think it was a role-playing game. I can't remember what the game was called. And then it turned out that he actually had employed or paid gamers to play under his account. And then when he tried to demonstrate his abilities, he was found, to be like completely wanting, essentially. So when you have an individual that promises self-driving cars and we don't see self-driving cars, an individual that promises robots in your home and yet we don't see robots in your home, and he gives very definitive deadlines as well, which again he never needed to do, it becomes very difficult to believe that when he says, okay, we're going to be flying to Mars by X date, that's going to happen, or we're going to see $1 trillion of revenue by 2030, and really believe that, right? Now, none of these things mean that his company can't be valued at the value it currently is. All I am saying, though, is that these things undermine how we view the company and what is possible long term, right? And it does sort of play into this narrative that essentially he's pumping the company, he's talking it up, as many founders would, obviously, but he's talking it up for the purpose of allowing early investors to exit at a premium and make a bag, and then leave the rest of us, with a overvalued company.
Clearly, the timelines have been shifting, and even though he has done great things in the meantime, but when it comes to putting numbers and kind of giving timelines, his track record isn't that great. And so from that perspective,
if you're going to value the dude's, companies and stock as being $10 trillion companies, what's the guy saying? The guy's saying we're going to have like space tourism, and then the people pumping out, your grandkids are going to be playing on the moon. Maybe, right? And that's what you're betting on. And
I think the problem with the valuation, though, is that it assumes that this is a critical and essential service and need, right? Do we have to go to the moon or Mars? Do we need space tourism, right? When you think about tourism in general, it's a nice to have. It's obviously a massive industry and will continue to be, but it wouldn't be considered a necessity, right? It's a luxury, if we're being honest. I know for many people it is an essential, but the truth is it is something that you only get to do if you have a relatively high level of disposable income, right? So I think for me, again, unless you can create an environment where people fundamentally have no choice but to rely on that service becomes a necessity. For me, it's very difficult to have a lot of confidence in some of the numbers that are being thrown around by SpaceX or any of these AI companies, actually. So it may become critical from a business perspective. But when you think about space and space tourism, to me, that is something that is going to be enjoyed by the ultra wealthy, not ordinary individuals.
I like talking about this stuff. I think it's interesting. I grew up watching Star Trek. I actually really like these kind of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Elon's going to be the one to do it. And he's highly untrustworthy. It should be obvious. And then again, people are leaving his companies. You can see it. Then this is actually a big story as well. It's not just Elon. There's a lot of shuffling going around. Google overhauls AI leadership as longtime chief scientist joins wave of exits. Wow. Demis Hassabis became the chairman of Google DeepMind, while Jeff Dean leaves to launch AI discovery startup. So this is actually huge news out of Google. You're getting, again, people moving around.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the point that Chris Norland was making around the fact there will be competition, because you saw this in the crypto space as well. You would see these big projects. So, you'd have Bitcoin. Then the individuals that invented Bitcoin, some of them decide, I don't like Bitcoin. Let's make different versions of Bitcoin. And then some of them are like, well, I don't like that. I don't like the philosophy. Let me break away and create Ethereum, et cetera, right? And again, I think it's going to be the same with AI as well, right? A lot of this intellectual capital and knowledge is in people's heads, right? So yes, you can write it down and say, okay, we've got copyright and trademarks, but you can't like remove knowledge from people's heads, right? So ultimately, if you lose these key individuals and they just decide, you know what, I don't want to work for my employer, I just want to set up my own business and make my own bag. How do you prevent that? How do you stop that? And yes, you can tie them up in contracts that sort of, prevent them from working for the competition or prevent them from doing anything for 3 years or whatever. But then you've got to pay them a huge amount of money in order to do that, right? So I think for me, this is really something else that has to be considered and cannot be ignored, right? What is the barriers of entry from creating a new AI protocol for these individuals? If they have enough backing and they're able to get enough data, which seems to be increasingly easier for companies like this to do, then what prevents them from creating a rival offering, as China has done really successfully so far?
In this space, Meta, for some reason, this is always a strange one to me. Meta releases coding agent to compete with OpenAI and Anthropic. Okay. The company, pressed by investors to generate revenue from AI, says its offering will cost less than popular alternatives. Now, the reason why I say this is strange to me is because Meta, Facebook, etc., just having their social media companies should be a cash cow for them. Yet suddenly they want to spend all this money to get into the AI space. Like, is it?
Yeah, I just think there's this ideological goal to own and win the race of artificial generalized intelligence. I just think they just see it as a winner takes all technology, and once they have it, and if they are the only ones that have it, um it's basically the end game of capitalism, right? It's like they own and control pretty much everything. So I think for me, it's this real fear and incentive of just economic dominance is kind of, and I know that sounds really hyperbolic and sensationalist, but that's all I can think, right? Because as he says, you already have very, very profitable companies. You're already very, very, very wealthy. You can't, economically, like, what more do you need? If you've got 50 billion, 100 billion, 800 billion, I mean, what more do you actually need in life from an economic perspective? But yet, we're still throwing huge amounts of money um, into developing AI. We're taking up a huge amount of natural resources to do this, and we're throwing a lot of money and leveraging, our political networks. If you are these billionaires that own these companies, to really push for this. And at the moment, it's not profitable at all, right? So why would you be doing all of this, right? There must be an end game in mind. And my question would be, even if it's not the end game I'm describing, what is this end game, right? That is ultimately the question. And what has been clear from OpenAI, at least, is that end game is to remove human capital from the job market and replace it with their service that all businesses will essentially be relying on. And it's similar to the model for Palantir, right? They want to become the default operating system for all governments, completely embed themselves and basically be, fully integrated with government, whereby a government cannot remove them, cannot cancel their services. And if that is the case, they basically can hold any government financially hostage and charge whatever they like, and by extension charge taxpayers, citizens, whatever they like.
Why so much investment in AI stuff, and then they want to be like a coding agent? They're already behind, and Elon Musk wants to get in that thing as well. So then you got just those four players, let alone all of the Chinese models that are coming out. This is going to be turning out a disaster, and then it's so much circular financing. So there's that.
Yeah, the circular financing has been talked about a lot. And to be fair, it's not unusual. I mean, it was something we saw in the telecommunications industry as well, where those that needed to build the infrastructure were basically borrowing from those that were selling the raw materials to build that infrastructure, right? So it's in and itself is not unusual, but equally, you know, it kind of feels like, and again, it's something Patrick Boyle, I'll mention his name again, talks about a lot. It becomes a situation where the customer and the supplier become more and more financially the same people, right? They're so, like the relationship financially is so incestuous, it almost becomes difficult to distinguish, like, is this real revenue? Is this a real cost? Or are they basically got this unofficial group arrangement, right? They're an unofficial group, which one can bring the other one down financially, right? So if one cannot pay the other, then suddenly, like, you find that both companies, basically crash and burn.
Slowed down and they got hit. I think that there is a moment coming where the Meta, Amazon, Google, Microsofts, one of them announces some diminishment of the spend. It is absolutely going to happen, and that's when you see a cascading effect.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I've actually been on the record saying if you see that happen without another one reporting the big ROI on those AI and CapEx spends, forget it. All bets are off.
Yeah, so essentially what they're saying here, and it's kind of similar to what happened to the subprime mortgage situation, where because everything is circular and you've got circular financing, you're lending money to your customers, right? So that your customers can then pay you back. So if there is less spend, and again, a lot of the spend that OpenAI is doing is going to places like Oracle and Microsoft and Google, right? So if they are spending less, and then Microsoft's and let's say Oracle's revenue is going down as a result, or vice versa, it has this issue whereby, okay, suddenly the ability for these companies to generate income reduces because they're all independent on each other. Suddenly loans cannot be paid, so they have to give up equity, maybe depending on the relationship and the financial agreements that are in place. And the whole house of cards basically just falls down because there's no external source of revenue outside of this bubble, right? Because what is understood at the moment is that customer demand and fees from other businesses, enterprise fees, are not enough to cover the underlying infrastructure and development costs, right? So the only way they can keep going is by lending to each other, buying from each other, selling to each other, and or seeking IPO fundraisers or venture capital fundraisers, right? That is the only way they seem to be able to keep going whilst they are going through this growth phase, this development phase, right? And the question is, how long can that last for before the whole thing crumbles and burns?
And how are they going to get this ROI in the next year or two?
It's hard, right?
Pretending. I love talking about SpaceX because no one wants to leave it. They're saying we might be free cash flow positive in 2034.
Right. Well, and
I think I'm going to.
Yeah, so they're going to be free cash flow positive in 2034. So what that basically means is by 2034, they're going to be generating more cash than they are burning, right? So income, let's imagine it's from AI, will be exceeding expenditure on AI. But note that's 4 years after they're assuming they're going to get $1 trillion of revenue. So they said they're going to get $1 trillion of revenue by 2030, but they're only going to be cash flow positive by 2034. So you just have to think about the actual quantum of numbers involved, right? And even at $1 trillion of revenue, you're still in a position where you're burning cash. It's absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Yeah. He's a great visionary. He casts a great vision, and then he takes a really long time to backfill against.
But there is no.
All this makes me think of is the monorail episode in The Simpsons with the monorail salesman. That's if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a very old Simpsons episode, but go back, look it up, and watch it. But that's what it makes me feel like when I think about people like Elon Musk. It's like that whole snake oil salesman type vibe is what I get.
No element of SpaceX that is trading on is revenue higher than we thought or lower? Is the satellite thing good or bad? It's purely this long-term dream. Maybe it does play out, but I mean, cash flow positive in 9 years or whatever.
You will not be 90.
Yeah.
You will be
It just feels
right
like it.
there,
That's
and
true.
you will love it.
They're actually, openly laughing about Elon Musk and stuff. Just think about that, like cash flow positive theoretically in 9 years, but then was it Deutsche Bank was saying, we're thinking more like a third of what Elon Musk says.
Scaler, but to selling the same type of compute that is available at Amazon, at Microsoft, maybe at Meta soon.
Exactly. So coming back to my question around intellectual property, this technology or a version of it, his rivals have it. And in many cases, they're selling to each other as well, right? They're selling these services and data centers to each other. So they're actually dependent on each other. So I think, if I recall correctly, in the prospectus for SpaceX, they actually had a contract with Anthropic, I think, if I remember correctly, which could be terminated on 30 days notice. So again, this is whoever it was going to be somebody that would be competing, taking market share and competing for this, revenue, right? So it would be a risk to this $1 trillion of revenue they're trying to achieve by 2030, right? Because obviously, there's somebody else that might take that revenue away from them. So again, it's really, really odd that these figures are being thrown around, and we don't really have a way, through normal conventional modeling of supporting these numbers, right? They just seem to be very, very ambitious, let's say. We're going to be generous with that term.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll find out. And the NeoClouds?
NeoClouds, CoreWeave, Nebius.
So that's SpaceX's value proposition right now, according to Elon.
Yes, and in fact, you don't even have to go to 2030. He said by the end of this year, they will hit $100 billion in ARR. And based on our numbers, 70% of that will come from that AI piece. And, almost 50 to 60% will be cloud hosting.
Okay, so I'm glad you are bringing this up. We have a redhead crossing the Bloomberg terminal that fits right in this. Microsoft's AI sales, this just crossing, mostly come from OpenAI, this according to disclosures. Microsoft disclosures suggest OpenAI is about 70% of AI sales. We see Microsoft extending a drop to a session low earlier of about 1.5%. It's bounced up a little.
Exactly. And this, again, it's well understood and many people have talked about this, but they're basically buying and selling from each other. So it doesn't suggest that there is this organic market that will support a $1 trillion revenue target in 4 years' time, because that can't be something. Well, I guess it could be something that's generated internally, right? But much of it's going to have to come outside of this circular financing arrangement.
Yeah.
Since then.
Yeah, it's bounced off that low.
Yeah, it's at down 0.8% right now. What does this tell you?
That there is incredible concentration. So when Elon says they will get to $100 billion in ARR and 70% of that is AI, the cloud compute consumption will still be Anthropic, or I don't think it's going to be OpenAI in the case of SpaceX, so that's not happening.
Yeah.
It'll be either Anthropic or Google. And those are the two companies that they've already partnered with.
And then you got this. Hedge funds take big hit in July after bruising sell-off. So oftentimes you'll see people come up on TV and they say, oh, you got to keep buying SpaceX. It's going to be fantastic. We're all going to make money. But they're basically just trying to sell you a pile of crap because they're taking a beating. And this is essentially what we're watching all together. How long can these companies borrow money? How long can these companies keep spending and not getting the return on investment that they need to be to justify all this stuff? And how long can people keep believing the smoke and mirrors of Elon Musk? But Elon is just one part of this larger bubble throughout the whole market and the economy. And then when Trump comes out on TV, and says, "Oh, guys, everything's great," that's counting all the investment going to the data center and such. So hope you guys see how a lot of this stuff is smoke and mirrors in the economy.
Yeah, so we're going to leave it there. And I think it's a really good and insightful video. And I do like this guy, which is why I wanted to cover this video because I think he does have a very entertaining take on many things. So as I say, definitely check out his channel. And if you feel inclined to, as I have done so, feel free to subscribe to his channel and follow him as well. But I think for me, this is just an ongoing episode in the SpaceX AI saga that we're all living through. I think it is clear that there is, in my view, a bubble, a financial bubble, which may or may not be sustainable. Ultimately, whether they're buying from each other or not, they can only do this if other services continue to be consumed by their enterprise clients and or customers such as ourselves. But ultimately, at some point, there's going to be a day of reckoning, I think, economically and financially for AI, right? AI, I don't think, can continue to consume, financing, capital, natural resources, whilst at the same time remaining at a relatively low price, right? So when you think about what you pay for something like AI, it is relatively low, and it's the same for business customers as well, relative to what they're spending to build and maintain AI centers and to buy GPUs, which have relatively short lives. So I think the chips that NVIDIA makes, I think they last only about 3 or 5 years, right? So if they're on the moon, on data centers there, how are you going to replace those? And arguably that might make the case then for space freight rather than space tourism, where there now becomes this need to pay for space travel, but for the purposes of freighting equipment from one place to another. And that's what ties us in, right? And that is what underpins the economy and therefore leaves the taxpayer ultimately with no choice. But ultimately, I think for me, it is interesting that SpaceX will prove, I think, to be a very valuable use case in the annals of history and economic history, and to see ultimately what happens. And it might be that, dare I say, we die before we see the ultimate results of what SpaceX turns into, whether it crashes or absolutely goes hyperbolic and literally to Mars. But yeah, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts and share your thinking around SpaceX, the IPO, and what you think, the future of AI and the company and Elon Musk's companies will look like. But until next time, take care. Peace.